They say one should never go too far. In the EO sector, this is meant literally. A dangerous and inhospitable world of swamps and marshes, inhabited by a feral cult so backwards they have no concept of the heresy they commit. Few who have ever stepped foot on the world's surface have made it back off, and those that did can't say for sure what it is they experienced. Only that it is a place of mud and death that should be avoided at all costs. Yet what they do not realise is that this lonely, quiet and seemingly isolated world and its inhabitants have touched many others in this galaxy, and not for the better. Hello everyone and welcome back to my little corner, where today we're going to be kicking off year 2 of the channel with a special one, my kit-bashed chaos cult of Nurgle, known only as the Stillwater Faithfull. So if you like kit-bashed minis with custom lore, cool stories and some mysteries, all based in a homebrew sector of the 40k galaxy, well this is the channel for you. But if you just want to see minis and aren't so worried about the history and the lore behind them, then skip forward in the video as they're all a bit further through. Still, if you enjoy yourself and find yourself coming back to these videos, then hit that sub button and give the video a like, as it will massively help out the channel. Also let me know all your world building ideas and what you're doing with your projects in the comments below, and we can have a chat about them. With all that said and done, thank you very much for watching, and let's get into the lore. For a few in the Imperium, the turn of a new millennia was meant to be a joyous time, like that of old, a time of new beginnings, new journeys and second chances. For many others, it is anything but for Captain Lester Daniken and the passengers and crew of the pilgrimage vessel 23926, the Breath of Saints, hell was about to become manifest. After traversing the warp for weeks en route to the EO sector, warp storms would explode through the galaxy, hitting the vessel upon re-entry into real space and causing unexpected system failures. Bursting through, they found themselves in unavoidable danger. Not only were they light years off course, but a colossal brown and green mass obscured their vision. They were in the gravitational pull of a nearby planet and heading right for it. Captain Daniken knew it was too late. Still, he initiated evasive procedures, but it was all in vain. They ploughed through the atmosphere and hit the swampland like a meteor, carving through the waterlogged ground in a horrific explosion of mud, fire and metal, ripping it in two before rolling to a cratered and pitiful stop, where it will remain in death, ruined, collapsed chunks of its former glory, guts spilled over a 3-mile trench, littered with debris and the dying. The water quickly rushed back in to fill the void that the ship had carved. Daniken awoke to find their efforts had not only saved his life, but he was not alone. Many others were also alive. Hundreds in fact, thousands. Many injured, unconscious, crying in trauma, screaming in pain, some even laughing in hysterics. Taking charge, Daniken and others helped search for other survivors, finding both the ship's minister, Ibrahim Lashtor, and another man, a charismatic man by the name of Malcolm Gray. Together they established encampments around the wreckage and enacted standard frontier survival protocols, including rescue and salvage operations, rationing, and setting up shelters. They surveyed their surroundings and found themselves to be in a humid jungle world with impossibly steep mountains and vast lowlands covered in swamps, marshes and bogs. The air was humid and thick with gases and spores, rich with pungent smells of blooming plants, wet earth and decay, mixed with the burning promethium and hot metal of the crash. However, within a short while of breathing the planet's air, it became clear that respirators would be required. For those fortunate enough to find one or fight for one, survival through those first few hours would be a mind-altering experience of humanity at its most extreme. For those who didn't, oblivion's embrace would come at the hands of another person, or through rapid infection, fungi, and fast-growing and often colourful spores. For the few hundred that remained, the world proved catastrophically hostile to long-term human habitation. Immense bamboo wetlands, stagnant flood basins capable of drowning any who would fall in, fungal lowlands of dense poisonous plant growths, and insect swarms carrying countless sicknesses and pathogens, all sought to make life all but a thread to grasp to. As the bodies were recovered and piled up, ready to be buried, a new danger would rear its head in the shape of a local predator, a massive and semi-intelligent Xenos primate that was highly territorial and moved in large tribes. These apes would begin stealing corpses, and seemingly, with a mass of bodies, developed a taste for human flesh. But as the corpse rotted beyond the point of eating, they soon turned to picking off living people, becoming more and more brazen each time. So society stuck by the wreckage of the crashed ship, but it was not long until power systems failed permanently, and the air and water purification became a daily hardship. Yet over time, the ship itself began to sink deeper into the earth, leaving it partially submerged, and the bodies in and around it that could not be recovered would begin to stink so unbearably that soon they would be required to leave. Despite this, there was one saving grace. It was clear that if the apes had survived here, then they had to be eating something. Dank would lead volunteer scouting parties into the swamps to find food, and soon they would discover a small deer-like creature that they would term a swamp kelpie. However, catching them was a completely different task. The people were not built for the swamps like these creatures were, and the few guns they had either did not work, jammed quickly, or were soon out of ammo. They themselves were loud and clumsy, meaning the few times they did spot anything, it was gone just as quickly. Dank, Lashdor, Grey, and others tried to maintain order. The starvation became a true issue, and losses were mounting rapidly. Whilst imperial doctrine and law was attempted to be held, the survivors slowly abandoned many aspects of imperial civilization, simply to continue existing, their number dwindling into the dozens, and with what little weapons they had, they launched an assault on the 8 tribes to the southeast, taking their den as their new home, leaving only a few, such as the minister who had refused to leave, back at the crash site. It was the first successful raid they had accomplished, and together the survivors devoured their first good meal in a long time. In this den, they began to build new lives. Injury and infections became a continual battle, and usually a fast track to a painful death. Insects and larvae needed to be cut or squeezed out of the skin daily. It was clear something had to change. Armour would be abandoned, and makeshift traps and snares would begin to be used. Bamboo blowpipes, makeshift nets, and crude hooks would be developed. They would begin to experiment with plants as medicines and food, and necessity meant learning quickly. What began as luck soon turned into a skill, and before long, over 3 years, not only did the tribe manage to feed itself, but a new generation began to sprout. Babies born to the swamps and marshes, a generation that in time would grow, honing their craft, learning the ways of the land from birth. The tribe would expand their territory, and soon they found themselves, more often than not, defeating their 8 rivals in combat, taking a second and third den, slowly building a perimeter around the crash site. Yet this slight hope of progress would almost come to a halt when a power struggle between Minister Lashdor and Malcolm Grey, who had both risen to be social leaders, with loyalists on either side, would fracture the tribe's unity. Lashdor and Grey's dispute was ultimately over faith, with Grey seeing past events as a sign that the Emperor had abandoned them, and the Minister seeing it as a test of faith. Dank himself was caught in the middle, but ultimately sided with the Minister that they needed to keep the faith, if for no one else, then for the hope of the community that rescue would one day come. This dispute would however topple over into violence when Grey's teenage son was killed by apes who ambushed his hunting party. After some ill-timed words by Ibrahim Lashdor, Grey would lash out and in a fury murder the minister with his bare hand, would lead to a full-scale revolt and end with the survivor tribe's unity collapsing entirely. Grey and his supporters taking over the first den, reducing those who had followed the minister to slavery and exiling Dank and many others to the jungle to form their own tribes. Split into 7 major groups, the tribes would spread out, taking various dens for themselves within a few miles of the crash site, and for the most part, they would begin to live in relative isolation from one another. Months later, and worried for the safety of his friend, Dank would seek out the minister. Entering the wetlands, he would rediscover his ruined ship, the swamp claiming it. Horrifically though, it was still surrounded by the unrecovered bloated bodies of the wreck, that somehow appeared to have stopped decaying halfway through. Worse yet, there were other bodies, newer bodies. Moreover, strange priests appeared to be lurking in and around the water's edge, with Grey holding the ship under his control, in the centre. Trying to hide, he would soon find the minister's body and those of his most loyal executed, their bodies thrown into the waters of the crash site that they had revered so much. He would, however, be ambushed by Grey's men and dragged in front of him. As a punishment for not staying exiled, Daniken would be drowned in the water, with Grey's men tying him up and throwing him into the swamp. Mouth filling with rank stale water, he could not hold it in for long. He gagged, choked, and in a sputter of coughs soon found himself inhaling. He felt the worms and larvae entering his mouth, his lungs filling up with every vomit-inducing thing the swamp of death had to offer. A short while later, he was hauled out and brought back from the brink by his own tribe, who had followed him there in secret. After vomiting up every bit of liquid his body had, he eventually stood, seemingly reinvigorated. He would then instruct his followers to embark on a crusade to destroy Grey entirely, if his followers were still faithful, that was. Over the next few years, the tribes would war against each other, until Daniken would defeat his enemy and kill Grey in armed combat at the feet of his old command throne, inside the ship, before embarking to crush the dissenting tribes in the dens. Whilst ultimately victorious, he would give power back to the next generation of each tribe, yet control, in reality, was now his, and he knew it. With all the tribes now under his rule, he was declared king, but instead of expanding, he would soon retreat back to the crash site, and taking his place on his own command throne, where he had once traversed the stars, he would become increasingly reclusive, giving orders where necessary, but ultimately stagnating. Greed and gluttony would replace his former athletic self, his body swelling with so much fat that upon his death 3 years later, it encompassed the throne he sat on and filled up much of the ship's deck, his breathing rig permanently fused to the folds of his skin. There it is said, he would remain, forever, slowly decaying, a putrid mockery of the emperor he once served, his final words being to keep the faith. Yet there are few alive who understood what the faith even was. In the wake of Daniken's death, war would once again come to the tribes, and as the years in the swamp had turned to decades, knowledge of the Imperium had all but died. Few, if any, now lived to remember it properly, and a new generation was starting to emerge. Those youngsters born to the swamps were growing up, and teaching them of the old ways of the Imperium, where people could fly and hop from star to star like jumping on giant lily pads of the marshes, meant taking them back to the crash site, to the corpse-laden swamps of death, where Daniken and so many more now rested. Starships became impossible concepts as the jungle and swamp reclaimed the wreckage, and as the descendants of the crash survivors no longer identified themselves as Imperial citizens, the wider galaxy faded from cultural memory entirely, simply becoming the Stillwater of the sky. New leaders would rise and fall in the game of power, but children learned history and the worship not through books, but through guided pilgrimage to the flooded wreckage of the ancient ship, where they would seek guidance from the shamans. The dead became heroes and icons, given over to the swamp, where their decay would see them immortalized in memory of their great lord. The swamp became scripture, truth distorted into a twisted parody of fact, and though the people were still faithful, what they were faithful to would slowly distort. For all they knew was the marshes of the mud, but they remained true and kept the faith as their great lord had wanted. Humanity's first, who had fled the evil star gods, defeated the great 8 tribes, killed the betrayer who had brought their tribes to war. He was the Emperor, the one known as the Dank King. They were his kin, and faith would lay in the Stillwater. This cult would begin to unite under the family of a spiritual leader known as Mother Maya, a shamanistic crone said to be so old that she had once met the Dank King himself when she was just a sapling. True or not, in time, few would ever dispute this woman's words. Originally, all notion of faith was led by Minister Lashtor, a zealous man who himself interpreted almost everything as the will of the Emperor, and justified it by any means necessary. He would lead the spiritual guidance of the survivors through to their tribal years and take refuge inside the ship's monastery. Yet as technological infrastructure decayed, his priesthood became responsible for looking after the wreckage and preserving ancestral knowledge, as well as performing spiritual guidance and ceremonial and sacred rites over members of the tribes. After his death and that of his followers at the hands of Grey, his work would be brought to ruin, destroyed, and the site would largely be abandoned, but for a few bizarre, makeshift shamans. These shamans spent extensive periods within the deepest swamps, collecting hallucinogenic fungal growths, all within and around the wreck, keeping up the process of maintaining the tribe's primitive filtration systems in Lashtor's absence. Over time, exposure to hallucinogenics, airborne spores, mixed with oxygen deprivation, would begin to produce intense shared visions among these shamans, likely started due to a breakdown in their iconic breathing rigs. Derived from emergency oxygen tanks and salvaged void ship components, these rigs have been repaired and modified continually, held together now with strips of reed and animal sinew, mostly continually, and air within them is damp, foul, and contaminated with spores. Yet these rigs are not seen as just necessary life support systems, but sacred relics. Yet it was after the acclaimed death of Daniken that things truly went off the deep end, as many of them saw him as a spiritual leader, the so-called Dank King. They began conducting funerary rites in his honour, submerging bodies into the swamp around the wreck site. Many more would join their order and bathe in the stagnant pools of decay, drinking its waters straight, as well as removing their rebreathers for extended periods of time, for deep hallucinogenic trips. Coming-of-age rituals would see parents drown their own offspring in these same waters. Those who survived were said to be reborn and stronger. Those who did not joined the Dank King, whom Mother Maya had begun to refer to as the grandfather. All of this would only work to guarantee infection, though many would die as a result of such events. Eventually, they did not. To breathe clean air is to be considered spiritually weak. Senior priests now deliberately use old, contaminated, or faulty rigs that purify the air just enough to keep one alive, but at the same time allow one to remain in almost constant stupor, resulting in infections, lung damage, and hallucinations that are interpreted as prophetic blessings. Blessings that would only prove themselves when visions proclaimed by Mother Maya would state that the beasts of before would come to aid them in their own wars against other tribes. 7 months later, at the Battle of Black Sump, a shaman would call to Mother Maya's blessings, only to witness rotting carcasses of dead beasts, kelpie, apes, and more rise from the waters and tear down their foe. Victory had come to the Faithfull, and Mother Maya's fame would spread like a rainstorm, with some seeing her as a witch, others as a prophet. In either case, her supporters heavily outweighed her detractors, and soon the tribes would be united once again. This time, united by faith, instead of divided by it. Yet it is her claim that all she does is interpret the blessings of the grandfather, and that the Dank King never truly died. He has simply become a living form of rot. In time, few within the Faithful would question her words, though none would ever dare to enter the wreck itself to prove it, for the holy beings that now lurk within it are too abominable even for the corpse-bathing cult to accept without losing their minds. The first confirmed Imperial recontact with the cult occurred in M42, some 110 to 120 years after a distress signal was sent from a void ship lost in the region. Signals registered as coming from a pilgrimage ship, with the last known Vox recording simply stating, "We have gone too far, impact unavoidable, we are going down." And so far it was named. Initial expeditionary reports incorrectly identified the vessel and its crew as lost, and the world uninhabited, yet viable for Imperial use. Within weeks, there were reports of eyes in the jungle, and ghosts spotted. Patrols would vanish soon after, and water purification systems became contaminated. An entire encampment seemingly disappeared into flooded terrain. Investigation teams would seemingly suffer the same fate, until closer inspection from orbit would reveal that these events were not the product of nature. Encampments were being deconstructed and stripped down for their parts. The world was not uninhabited, as once believed. Efforts to reclaim the world would eventually collapse following the Battle of Slow Creek Basin, during which Imperial patrols from Castile and Preston reported attacks by hooded figures using blowpipes and crude weapons, hooks, stake-like wooden axes, and small arms fire. Fighting back, it soon became clear that the tribe was repurposing Imperial gear to use against them. When the tide quickly began to swing in the Imperial's favour, Vox Trackvic suddenly spoke of reanimated fauna emerging from the swamp's waters. Survivors' testimony would also back up these claims, with references made to corpses of antlered beasts charging through gunfire, and ape-like monsters, already half rotting, tearing through squads of men. The world was subsequently quarantined, and so far has remained this way. Orders are that no one is to go too far. Despite this, it may not have stopped the Stillwater Faithfull coming to them. A number of months after the battle at Slow Creek, Mother Maya, drunk in a stupor of hallucination, would suddenly get up from the water's edge and walk into the swamp, not emerging for many hours. Stunning those around, she would return, claiming that the Dank King had called her and that she had been to another world. Her story would be put to the test when the tribe would witness her once again brought into the waters a few days later. It is claimed she was not seen for 7 days. This time, she would return with an item. The story was true. So when it was that she came to the tribe and said that the waters were calling others, they did not hesitate. They'd go in and find glory for Stillwater, for the Dank King. On this quest, she would send her sons, Reed and Lake, 2 warriors of renown amongst the tribes. Both men and their respective raiding parties would assault other worlds and bring back both bounty and slaves, dragging them tied, netted, exhausted, and gagging through the waters back to the swamps that they had left. Subsequent raids would take them to the flooded underhives and sewers and industrial runoff basins and other swamps and marshes across the galaxy. Where did they go? They did not care. In their eyes, the grandfather sends them wherever he chooses, and all must return to the swamp of the Dank King. Imperial enforcement has declared these events as unsubstantiated and anomalous warp activity, if true, yet has failed to investigate such claims at this time. However, most recently, an event saw an outbreak of infection spread through an underhive of a world in a distant sector. Readings seem to match the spore growths found on the world of Far. Though this does not prove the cults themselves are getting off-world, what it did prove is that at least somebody had been there and left. To the faithful, they do not perceive themselves as heretics. They have simply done what had to be done and followed the natural order of things. To them, it is the Imperium that are the heretics. They are an amalgamation of myths and tales of Xenos and traitors, of aliens and worse. To the faithful, they themselves have always remained loyal. They are, after all, the still faithful. They are still a young cult, but with life expectancy being so short on such a world, made worse by the cult's beliefs, and generations passing so quickly, what was once known has now been lost and reborn, remade and distorted. Whilst the Imperium looks to isolate the world until resources can be spared to deal with it, the cult looks to expand, and Mother Maya's latest prophecy may be the worst of all, that soon the faithful will be united with their ancestors, and they shall fight side by side with the generations who have gone before. Through the still waters of the sky they shall march, hand in hand, with the Dank King himself. Though the Imperium may not have heard it, if this prophecy is true, then it may bring many worlds and the EO sector to their knees before anyone knows what has happened. Well, that's it for the lore, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like, as it really would mean the world. I really tried to make these guys out to be something new, where the last cult that I did was very old and ancient, and I wrote this in a way that most of the stuff in the lore isn't things that the Imperium would actually know, but instead told from like the cult's perspective and how they evolved as a culture, to be like a parody so backwards that you think you're going forwards as a society, if you get what I mean. I also wanted them to be able to expand and get off-world, so having them go through the water I thought was a cool idea, and the idea of like a rotting swamp man catching you in a net and then dragging you into a swamp where you basically drown until you emerge with worms and bugs and death in your lungs, and in a marshy hellhole where you just live as a slave. If you live at all, you're likely to just die because of some spore grew in your brain, or an insect decided to like burst out your body or something like that. It's just awful and gross and so Nurgle, and I love it. These minis themselves were actually a gift from my best mate a little while ago. I don't actually have many friends, and fewer even into the Warhammer, so it meant a lot when he gave me this, like went out of his way to get me them, despite not being a huge fan of Warhammer himself. So I wanted to do something like special with them. So doing this, I feel like I accomplished that. They're made using the Rotmire Krieg Nurgle cult, with some like cordal weapons and smash waist backpacks and for the breathing rigs. I just used a bit of guitar string to like make the tubing for like the hoses for that like go in their mouths and stuff, so for them to breathe. And for any that haven't actually got it in their mouth, I just used the ends of the, I think they're the rebreathers on the Krieg kit. I used them to make it look like they could, if they want to, still use a rebreather. They've just like got it out of their mouth at that time. I did use a bit of green stuff to make the cloaks, and then on the bases were made using rocks and astrogranite, and then I used a bit of resin just to make it look really cool and like their feet were in raw water. To apply the resin onto the bases carefully, I used a injector for like cat medicine. It's one that you would just like squirt medicine to a cat's mouth. I had a couple of them lying about, and I thought if I use them I can slowly use a little plunger on them to get it onto the base without making too much mess and like overloading it. If you also, to get it looking good, if you put a little ring of astrogranite around the very edge of the base, you can then fill it up and it acts as sort of like a wall, keeping the resin inside the base. I then added some fake plants and tufts and done. My favourite model is probably the leader here. I just love his little like flamer and his ridiculous fishing hook with like a gun strapped to it. It's just so stupid and over the top, but I think it works. The Kelpie here were from the Age of Sigmar new Nurgle range, and the apes were taken from the Warcry or Underworld box sets, like one of those things. But that's it guys, I hope you liked it. Please subscribe for more, as I have plenty more to come, plenty more factions and cults and regiments and gangs on the way. But until then, give me a message in the comments below, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye guys.